The last golden leaves of the sacred oak trembled in the cold October wind when Onacona felt the gazes turn away from her for the final time. Her bare feet stepped on the damp earth of the trail she had known since childhood, but now each step carried her away from everything she had once called home. The baby in her arms whimpered softly, oblivious to the weight of exile they carried together. She pulled the deerskin blanket tighter around the small body, protecting him from the cutting wind that descended from the Blue Ridge Mountains. The tribal council's decision still echoed in her mind like the distant sound of war drums. Her love for Henry Morrison, the fur trader who had arrived 2 winters before, had been more than a transgression. It had been a betrayal in the eyes of her people. The white man had departed when he learned of the pregnancy, leaving behind only empty promises and a broken heart. Now, with her mixed-race son in her arms, Onacona paid the price for the passion she had dared to feel beyond the boundaries of her race. The sun began to decline when she reached the Hiwassee River, its turbulent waters reflecting the orange sky of evening. From there on, every step would be into unknown territory, far from the protection of her family and the traditions that had shaped her soul. Her mother, Amayeta, had wept in silence when the elders proclaimed the banishment, but dared not challenge the decision that would forever separate mother and daughter. The last look they exchanged carried decades of unspoken love and the pain of a final goodbye. Onacona knew that crossing the river meant entering Shawnee lands, where her Cherokee people were considered ancestral enemies. The stories of war between the tribes had been told around fires since she could remember, feeding generations of distrust and spilled blood. But hunger and desperation had become more present companions than fear, and her son needed shelter before the harsh mountain winter reached them. She knelt on the rocky bank and drank the cold water from the river, feeling it run down her parched throat. The baby opened his light eyes, unwanted inheritance from his father, and she saw in them the same determination that kept her walking. It didn't matter what awaited them on the other side. They would face together the destiny their choices had created. With one last silent prayer to the spirits of her ancestors, Onacona entered the cold waters of the Hiwassee, carrying her son toward the enemy territory that might be their only salvation. The strong current of the river almost knocked her down when Onacona stepped on a smooth stone covered with moss. She stumbled, instinctively pressing the baby against her chest, and managed to balance herself using a willow branch that hung over the water. Little Degotoga, as she had chosen to call him in her native tongue, remained quiet, as if he understood the gravity of that moment. His blue eyes, so different from hers, watched the treetops swaying above them, oblivious to the danger that surrounded them. When she finally reached the opposite shore, Onacona allowed herself a moment of rest, hidden among the tall reeds that grew by the water. Her soaked clothes clung to her body, and she shivered from both cold and fear. Shawnee territory stretched before her like an unknown vastness, full of trails she didn't know and dangers she couldn't predict. The smell of the earth was different here, wilder, less familiar, and even the birdsong sounded strange to her ears, accustomed to the sounds of her native village. She began walking again, following a deer trail that cut through the dense forest. Hours passed slowly, marked only by the movement of the sun through the treetops and the growing weight of fatigue in her limbs. Degotoga had fallen asleep, lulled by the constant rhythm of her steps, and she took advantage of the silence to sharpen all her senses. Any suspicious sound could mean the presence of Shawnee warriors, and she had no illusions about what would happen if she were discovered as a Cherokee intruder on their lands. The aroma of smoke reached her when the sun was already low on the horizon, bringing with it the promise of fire and, perhaps, food. Onacona followed the scent carefully, moving silently among the trees as her father had taught her during the hunts of her childhood. Through a clearing, she glimpsed a small log cabin with white smoke rising lazily from its stone chimney. It wasn't a typical Indian construction, but it also didn't seem entirely white, something between the two worlds, as she herself had become. From her hiding place among the bushes, Onacona observed a solitary figure moving around the cabin. It was a tall man, with dark hair tied in a long braid, wearing clothes that mixed Indian style with white traders' pieces. His movements were careful and deliberate, like those of someone accustomed to living alone on the frontier between different worlds. She held her breath when he stopped and looked directly in her direction, as if he had sensed her presence. For a moment that seemed eternal. His eyes searched the vegetation where she hid, and Onacona prayed that the evening shadows would keep her invisible. The man took several steps toward the place where Onacona was hiding, and she felt her heart race like a war drum. Dagatoga chose that moment to stir restlessly, emitting a small whimper that echoed through the silent forest. Onacona closed her eyes, knowing she had lost her only advantage. When she opened them again, the stranger was standing just a few meters away, watching her with an expression that mixed curiosity and caution. He spoke in Shawnee, his voice deep and controlled, but she shook her head, indicating she didn't understand. Then he tried a few words in English and finally in Cherokee, demonstrating familiarity with the frontier languages. Onacona responded hesitantly, explaining her situation in a few words laden with shame. She was a banished Cherokee, mother of a mixed-race child, seeking shelter before winter killed her. She expected hostility, perhaps violence, but found only thoughtful silence. The man introduced himself as Pemoussa, son of a Shawnee mother and French father, raised between two worlds as she now lived. His cabin served as an informal trading post, where Indians and whites could exchange goods without the usual tensions of encounters between races. He knew well the weight of isolation and the pain of not belonging completely to any place. Without saying more, he made a gesture indicating she should follow him, and Onacona stood trembling, still not believing the unexpected kindness. Inside the cabin, the warmth of the fireplace enveloped her frozen body like a maternal embrace. Pemoussa prepared a soup of corn and dried meat, placing the steaming bowl before her without waiting for thanks. Onacona ate slowly, savoring each spoonful as if it were the first meal of her life. Dagatoga woke and cried, and she nursed him discreetly, noticing how Pemoussa respectfully averted his gaze, giving her the privacy she needed in that intimate moment. When the child fell asleep again, Pemoussa spoke about his own story. He had grown up rejected by the Shawnee because of his French blood and despised by whites for his Indian heritage. He had built that solitary life on the frontier as a form of survival, creating a space where differences could temporarily coexist. Onacona listened to every word, recognizing in his voice the same loneliness she carried in her heart. There, in that cabin lost between enemy territories, two exiles had found an unexpected refuge in the mutual understanding of their shared pain. The following days brought a strange and comforting routine. Onacona helped Pemoussa with the cabin's tasks, preparing food and taking care of small repairs, while he went out to check his traps and negotiate with traders who occasionally passed by the trail. Dagatoga grew stronger each day, his blue eyes shining with growing curiosity about the world around him. Pemoussa watched the child with silent tenderness, sometimes making small wooden toys that he discreetly left within the baby's reach. One morning, while Onacona was washing clothes in the nearby stream, a group of Shawnee warriors emerged from the forest. She froze, holding Dagatoga against her chest, preparing for the worst. But the men greeted her with respect, referring to her as Pemoussa's woman and asking about her health and the babies. She then understood that her host had created a story that protected her, presenting her as his wife who had recently arrived from a distant village. Pemoussa confirmed the version when he returned at evening, carrying beaver pelts he had traded for provisions. He explained that the lie was necessary to ensure her safety, but that she could leave whenever she wanted. Onacona looked around the cabin that had become her temporary home, feeling for the first time in months something like peace. The idea of leaving that refuge filled her with an anxiety she didn't expect to feel. That night, after Dagatoga fell asleep, they talked more deeply about their past lives. Pemoussa spoke about the Shawnee woman he had loved and lost to smallpox 3 years before, and how that loss had pushed him into complete isolation. Onacona shared memories of her Cherokee childhood, her grandmother's teachings about medicinal plants, and the pain of seeing her love for Henry Morrison destroy everything she had once considered sacred. The silence that followed was filled only by the crackling of the fire and the soft breathing of the sleeping child. Pemoussa hesitantly extended his hand and lightly touched hers, a simple gesture that carried the weight of all understanding between two wounded souls. Onacona didn't pull away, feeling for the first time since the banishment that perhaps she could rebuild her life on the ashes of what she had lost. The touch lasted only a few seconds, but left a deep mark on both of them. Like the first crack in ice that announces the arrival of spring, winter arrived with a ferocity that surprised even the frontier veterans. Snow covered the cabin like a white blanket that isolated them from the outside world, creating a cocoon of forced intimacy. Onacona and Pemoussa developed a domestic routine that flowed naturally, as if they had been companions for years. She prepared meals with the provisions he had stored, while he kept the fire burning and repaired equipment by candlelight. Dagatoga took his first wobbling steps around the cabin, clinging to furniture and laughing with childish joy. Pemoussa built small wooden obstacles to challenge the child, and Onacona watched with a tight heart as he became a silent but present father figure. The baby began to babble sounds that mixed Cherokee and Shawnee, creating his own hybrid language that perfectly symbolized the union of different worlds. One night, when the storm raged outside with particular violence, Onacona woke shivering not just from cold, but from nightmares about her past. Pemoussa found her sitting by the fire, holding sleeping Dagatoga and staring fixedly at the flames. Without saying a word, he sat beside her and offered his blanket, wrapping both of them in its warmth. She allowed herself to lean against his shoulder, feeling his silent strength as a safe harbor in the emotional storm that still haunted her. They began to talk about the future for the first time, discussing what would happen when spring came and the paths opened again. Pemoussa spoke about the possibility of moving to an even more remote region, where they could live without the complications of tribal identities. Onacona considered the proposal, but part of her still felt the call of her Cherokee heritage, the need for Dagatoga to know his maternal roots even if he was rejected by them. The conversation was interrupted by a strange sound from outside, heavy footsteps in the snow, despite the storm. Pemoussa stood immediately, grabbing his rifle and indicating for Onacona to hide with the child. Through the ice-covered window, they saw shadowy figures approaching the cabin, moving with the care of those who know the art of war. Onacona's heart raced when she recognized the familiar outlines of Cherokee warriors, and she knew that her past had finally caught up with her in that improvised refuge. The knock on the door echoed through the cabin like a drumbeat announcing destiny. Pemoussa looked at Onacona, a silent question in his eyes, and she nodded, knowing there was no more running. He opened the door slowly, keeping his rifle in defensive position, and 5 Cherokee warriors entered, bringing with them the cutting cold of the night and the weight of unfulfilled missions. The group's leader was Galihiati, Onacona's cousin and respected warrior of her former village. He looked at her with a mixture of relief and disappointment, his features hardened by the journey through the storm. He spoke in Cherokee, informing her that her mother Amayeta had become gravely ill during the winter and asked to see her daughter one last time before joining the ancestors. The news struck Onacona like a spear to the heart, and she had to hold onto the wall to keep from falling. Galihiati explained that the tribal council had decided to temporarily suspend the banishment, allowing her to return to say goodbye to her mother. But there were conditions. She would have to leave the mixed-race child behind, as his presence in the village continued to be an offense to the elders. Onacona felt the world crumble around her, understanding that she was being forced to choose between her dying mother and her innocent son. Pemoussa remained silent throughout the entire conversation, but his rigid posture betrayed growing tension. When Galihiati looked at him with suspicion, asking about his identity and intentions, Onacona quickly responded that he was her protector, an honorable man who had offered shelter when she needed it most. The answer seemed to partially satisfy the Cherokee warrior, but his eyes remained fixed on Pemoussa, as if trying to decipher hidden secrets. The night passed in tense vigil, with the Cherokee warriors sleeping on the cabin floor, while Onacona stayed awake, holding Dagatoga and facing the most difficult decision of her life. Pemoussa approached her in the dark and whispered that he would take care of the child if she needed to leave, that he had learned to love both mother and son during those months of living together. His words brought both comfort and pain, for she knew that accepting his offer meant dividing her heart between two worlds once more. Morning came clear and cold, with the sun reflecting on the snow like thousands of diamonds scattered across the forest. Onacona had made her decision during the dark hours of dawn, weighing filial love against maternal instinct on a scale that seemed impossible to balance. She rose with Degotoga in her arms and walked to where Pemoussa was preparing breakfast, her eyes red from a night without tears that refused to fall. Without words, she placed the child in his arms, and both understood that this was a temporary goodbye that could become permanent. Pemoussa held the baby with the delicacy of a true father, silently promising he would protect that small life with his own, if necessary. Degotoga looked at his mother with bright blue eyes, still too innocent to understand she was leaving, but sensitive enough to perceive the sadness hanging in the air. Galihiati and his warriors waited impatiently, eager to begin the return journey before the weather changed again. Onacona gathered her few possessions, including the bead necklace her grandmother had given her in childhood, and said goodbye to the cabin that had become her home. Every familiar object seemed to beg her to stay, but the call of blood and duty to her dying mother were stronger than any personal desire. When she turned to take one last look, Pemoussa was standing in the doorway with Degotoga in his arms, both framed by the golden light of the morning sun. The scene engraved itself in her memory like a precious painting she would carry forever, regardless of what the future brought. He raised the baby's small hand in a gesture of farewell, and she saw silent tears streaming down his face, marked by sun and wind. The trail back to Cherokee territory seemed longer and more treacherous than the original journey, each step taking her not just physically, but emotionally, away from the life she had built during those winter months. Onacona walked like a divided woman, with half her heart heading toward her mother's deathbed, and the other half remaining forever in that cabin lost between worlds, where she had learned that true love sometimes means letting go of those we love most. The Cherokee village had changed during her absence, as if winter had aged not just the landscape, but also the people. Onacona was received with cautious looks and silences heavy with judgment, but no one dared prevent her passage when Galihiati escorted her directly to her mother's cabin. Amayeta lay in her bed of furs, diminished by illness, but still radiating the dignity that had always characterized her. The reunion between mother and daughter was a moment of silent reconciliation that healed wounds that seemed impossible to heal. Amayeta touched Onacona's face with trembling hands, reading in her daughter's features the stories of suffering and discovery she had lived during exile. They talked in whispers about the past, present, and uncertain future, and for the first time since the banishment, Onacona felt completely accepted and understood. For 3 days, she remained by her mother's side, caring for her with the devotion of a daughter who had learned the value of family through loss. Amayeta spoke about Degotoga with a tenderness that surprised Onacona, referring to her mixed-race grandson as a bridge between different worlds, a child destined to carry the best of his multiple heritages. She made Onacona promise she would raise the boy with pride in his origins, regardless of others' opinions. On the morning of the 4th day, Amayeta departed peacefully to join the ancestors, holding her daughter's hand and whispering words of love and forgiveness that would echo forever in Onacona's soul. The funeral was conducted with all the honor due to a respected matriarchy, and no one questioned the banished daughter's presence during the ceremonies. But when the ashes settled and the rituals ended, the reality of exile returned like a persistent shadow. Onacona left the village the following morning, carrying only reconciled memories and the certainty that she belonged where she had left her heart. The journey back to Pemoussa's cabin was a race against time and against her own fears, for every hour away from Degotoga seemed like a stolen eternity. When she finally spotted the smoke rising from the familiar chimney, she ran the last meters like a possessed woman, arriving at the door at the exact moment Pemoussa was coming out to check what had disturbed the horses. They looked at each other in silence for a moment that contained all the unspoken words, all the accumulated longing, and all the hopes about the future they could build together. Degotoga was sleeping in the improvised cradle Pemoussa had built, grown and changed, even in the few days of separation. Onacona picked him up, feeling the familiar weight of her child, and knew she had finally found her place in the world, not in a specific village or defined territory, but in the love that three wounded souls had built together in a cabin lost between enemy worlds, where differences transformed into strength and where the future stretched before them like an unexplored trail, full of possibilities and hope. If you like this story, leave a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next stories.